As some of you know, my spouse began a new year at a new school just a mere 4 weeks ago. It's the first time Cola's teaching American history, and so thanks to a recommendation from our ministerial intern, Sally, this summer we dove into an American history podcast called The Dollop. Neither of us are avid podcast listeners, as we both have blessedly short daily commutes. But over the course of the summer, we did drive from Needham to Quebec, Portland, Washington, D.C., Rehoboth Beach, Boothbay Harbor, and Syracuse. So we had a higher than average amount of time in the car. Perfect podcast conditions. The Dollop typically explores an unusual and little-known aspect of American history, ranging from the colonial era to today. It's hosted by two anti-capitalist and foul-mouthed comedians, Dave Anthony and Gareth Reynolds. There's really a lot of swearing, which is a good match for driving down and then back up again the East Coast on I-95. Probably my favorite episode tells the tale of the American War on Squirrels. It lasted centuries, and there were heavy casualties. It began soon after European colonists arrived on this land, which had been mindfully stewarded for generations upon generations by the indigenous peoples of the Americas. It is estimated that prior to colonization, there were 1 billion squirrels living in the forests of North America, coexisting with their human neighbors. But European colonists, as we know, were not interested in maintaining a balance with wildlife. They were not even able to respect, to put it mildly, the native peoples of this continent, much the less its animal creatures. Europeans cleared forests to make room for wheat and cornfields, and as the East Coast forests and major predator populations shrunk, a portion of those aforementioned billion squirrels decided to feast upon the neat rows of grain that had sprung up in the forest's place. Squirrels decimated crop fields. Thus was, in the minds of the European colonists, the first shot fired in the Great War with the squirrels. The colonists decided the squirrel must be eradicated. For example, for a time in the 1700s in Virginia, every able-bodied man was required to present 12 squirrel tails a year to the local justice of the peace or face a fine. Around the same time period in Pennsylvania, a bounty was paid on squirrel tails. It nearly bankrupted the Commonwealth, for as we know, there are a lot of squirrels. Ohio allowed for a time for taxes to be paid in squirrel scalps. During the early years of the United States, the Squirrel Frolic became a regular event across the country, with betting and prizes for whoever procured the most squirrel tails by the end of the day or week. When the United States entered World War I, squirrel eradication was at its height, particularly against the California ground squirrel. Because of the food resources needed to support American and Allied troops abroad, food rationing became a nationwide program with meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays. And the squirrel population was continuing to feast on our fields. California set aside $40,000 of its wartime funding for a week-long Kill the Squirrels campaign. In propaganda materials, cartoon squirrels were depicted in German spiked helmets with mustaches similar to Germany's then Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kill the Squirrel campaign recruited children to the cause. Cash rewards were offered to schools whose students submitted the most number of squirrel tails. Why hesitate, the propaganda asked. We can get 'em. How? Poison 'em. Gas 'em, drown 'em, shoot 'em, trap 'em, submarine 'em. Yes, we encourage children to use poison gas and guns to kill squirrels. By the time of the first squirrel week had ended, California's children had turned in over 100,000 squirrel tails. This campaign went on more or less through the end of World War II. Some estimates believe that there are still, though, over 1 billion squirrels living in North America. Obviously, the war on squirrels was a fruitless endeavor and dangerous to our ecosystem. While farmers then and now may view squirrels as pests, like most any other creature, the squirrel has a role to play in the health of our interdependent environment. They spread seeds for trees and truffles. They eat other common pests like insects and smaller rodents. And they are prey for a variety of larger creatures, each essential to the balanced circle of life in North America. Some human societies have a short-sighted tendency to forget that a balanced circle of life is essential for our own survival as well. I'm reminded of these words adapted from a speech attributed to 19th century Squamish leader Chief Seattle. The earth does not belong to humanity. Humanity belongs to the earth. All things are connected like the blood that unites us all. Humanity did not weave the web of life. We are merely a strand in it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. This indigenous sensibility is radically different than the perspective of our own Puritan spiritual ancestors, who were taught that the Bible gave them dominion over the earth. I would argue that balanced interdependence is still radically different as a sensibility than the dominant American culture today. But perhaps like me, you are not an avid gardener or farmer or birder, and thus don't have any ill will toward the squirrel. It helps that they are very cute. This summer in the Boston Globe, a journalist wrote a story about British biologist and entertainer Simon Watt, whose comedy program, The Ugly Animal Preservation Society, helps to save, well, animals far less cute than your average squirrel. As the journalist Linda Rodriguez McRobbie writes, Watt hopes to save the creatures that most people find too icky, too prickly, and too creepy to care about. We humans have the tendency to rank creatures by our own beauty standards, or by their friendliness toward us, or by their usefulness to us as food or clothing. If we do not find a creature pretty, or sociable, or advantageous to us, we tend to kill them, directly or indirectly. And not all animals are as resilient and unstoppable as the North American squirrel species. The Ugly Animal Preservation Society lifts up animals that have neither the cuteness, nor the charm, nor the commercial usefulness to humankind to attract much conservation attention. The Preservation Society's mascot is the blobfish, which looks like its name. Like other ugly animals they lift up, the blobfish is an endangered species who evolved for centuries, millennia, to be part of our global ecosystem. As Unitarian Universalists, we say in our first principle that we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and in our seventh principle that we respect the interdependent web of all existence. Modern queer Unitarian Universalist minister and professor, Reverend Dr. Sherry Prudhomme writes, a prevalent theme in eco-theology is the radical interdependence of all existence and the accompanying mandate to view humankind as embedded in a complex web of relationships with other organisms that have intrinsic value. The theological stance of the interconnectedness of all existence is commonplace in today's Unitarian Universalist congregations. It provides a basis for environmental justice work that includes all creatures and life forms in the moral circle of concern. And it provides an important counterpoint to the position that the earth exists solely to serve the needs and wants of humankind. Though we have our first and seventh principles to guide our ethics, it's hard to maintain the eco-theological stance of worth and dignity for all creatures living in interdependence. We have a hard enough time not judging other people for their beauty or their charm or their usefulness. And I'm sure we all have our least favorite creatures, don't we? Well, mine are leeches. I hate leeches. They were quite a problem where I lived with our Unitarian siblings in spirit in Northeast India, which during the monsoon season is one of the wettest places on earth. The leeches were not just in the rivers and streams, like what I read in Little House on the Prairie as a child. It was so wet everywhere that leeches slunk out of the streams and onto neighboring plants, stretching themselves long and thin off of leaves and branches, reaching for your skin. It was so gross. I admit that, well, Chief Seattle and Simon Watt and Reverend Dr. Prudhomme assure me that all creatures have an essential purpose on our earth. I admit I could not find a strong ecological purpose for leeches. So I want to share with you about my second least favorite creature, the mosquito, instead. Mosquitoes were also a problem where I lived in northeast India, where they could transmit prophylaxis-resistant malaria. A particular genus of mosquito spread the Zika virus, a global epidemic, in 2015 and 16. And right now in Massachusetts, we're having a resurgence of triple E, Eastern equine encephalitis, a mosquito-transmitted virus. This week, the news reported that 10 Massachusetts residents have become symptomatic from triple E, and 2 have died. I didn't realize how deadly triple E could be until I went to the senior youth group cookout last Sunday at dusk, and one of our teens informed me that a third of folks with symptomatic triple E die from the virus. Modern entomologist Professor Matan Shalomi writes that mosquitoes may well be the deadliest animal in the world to humans, even more so than ourselves. But he notes only a fraction of mosquito species can carry diseases that infect humans, and regardless, all mosquitoes play an important role in the ecosystem. Inconvenient to us as they are, mosquitoes are indispensable to the ecosystems in which they live. From fish to amphibians to birds and bats, mosquitoes are an important food source, especially in the Arctic, of all places, and they are important pollinators. Mosquitoes have a major effect on the caribou migration, if you can believe that, and it's unknown what would happen to the caribou if they didn't have swarms of mosquitoes to direct them on their historic migration routes. Professor Shalomi also notes that the typical method of widespread mosquito eradication, pesticides, have direct negative effects on many other species, including the people we are trying to protect from mosquito-borne illnesses. Indeed, not all of us were fortunate enough to receive the late afternoon phone call to Needham landlines about the town-wide spraying of mosquito-targeting pesticides just over a week ago. I don't know if my spouse and my dogs were outside as pesticides fell from overhead. There are other ways to protect ourselves without eradicating other species. We need a new attitude and new practices to save ourselves and our neighboring species. At the climate strike in downtown Boston on Friday, one of my favorite handmade posters was held by a high schooler. It read, "We march because they can't," surrounded by images of the world's animal creatures, mostly cute, charming ones, of course. One of our great challenges as we address the climate crisis before us is that as a species grown accustomed to controlling and dominating our environment, we struggle to let life go on where and when it can, as we heard from Dr. Frost in our reading. Drawing from the Jewish scriptures, 20th century Kenyan environmentalist and Nobel Peace Prize winner Wangari Maathai said, "We need to rediscover our common experience with other creatures on Earth and recognize that we have gone through an evolutionary process with them. They may not look like us, with their wings and scales and fur. We may not like some. Others, like mosquitoes," she really used mosquito, "like mosquitoes we may detest, but they are part of the process of life beginning and being sustained on this planet." An apt analogy is Noah in Genesis. Do you see, I brought a sermon illustration. I never do this. Oh, the animals, the rainbow, the mountain. Okay. An apt analogy is Noah in the book of Genesis, who found a pair of each species and 2 by 2 placed them into his ark, mosquitoes and reptiles among them. Noah was not commanded to pick only those that were useful to him. He sheltered them all. God recognized they are part of us. They needed the chance to survive as well. And in giving them this chance, God gave us a chance too. Now we must give that chance back to ourselves and replenish the earth. We struggle to remember that every creature has a place on the ark that is our planet. We struggle to follow the ethic of eco-theology. But at the climate strike and among First Parishioners working for personal and systemic climate justice, I remember the words of 20th century Christian poet Denise Levertov. We have only begun to love the earth. We've only begun to imagine the fullness of life. How could we tire of hope? So much is in bud. How can desire fail? We've only begun to imagine justice and mercy, only begun to envision how it might be to live as siblings with beast and flower, not as oppressors. Surely our river cannot already be hastening into the sea of non-being. Surely it cannot drag in the silt all that is innocent. Not yet, not yet. There is too much broken that must be mended, too much hurt we have done to each other that cannot yet be forgiven. We have only begun to know the power that is in us if we would join our solitudes in the communion of struggle. So much is unfolding that must complete its gesture. So much is in bud. May we learn to love our neighbors, of our own species and all others, because each and all have inherent worth. May we transform how we live with beast and flower as interdependent siblings, not oppressors. May this be so. Blessed be, and amen.